It's not just BLM that we on the right fear. All liberal/left movements evoke a terror reaction from those on the right. It is easy to dismiss these responses as a consequence of racism or greed or some other moral failing, but it takes more than a sense of superiority to generate the antipathy that movements on the left generate. When we hear about people disadvantaged by capitalism, it seems a small matter to devise ways to correct the imbalance. What is more normal or natural to think if everyone has a decent home and food, we are all the better for it? What is more understandable than thinking there is something wrong with anyone who would oppose giving help to the underprivileged? People rarely consider the gulf that exists between the left and right. Despite efforts made to muddy the distinction and reconcile the differences, when a choice must be made, people can only go with one of two options. They are quite distinct. The one option gives people a sense of freedom and power. Yet, at its heart, liberals exhibit a sense of ownership that is socialists and prioritizes public ownership. Most observers would say liberals care more for the community and the good of all than they do about property rights. Libertarians and capitalists want property rights respected. They believe in private ownership and markets. In everyone's reality, the left and right are opposed to one another. A person opposed to private enterprise and the mechanism of the market is opposed by those who support private property ownership. This observation is valid, but only up to a point. Neither group is a true class. Class X is not such that no Y is contained in it. The left and right are not pure classes, but abstractions only valid in terms of each other. Liberals exist as a contrast to conservatives and vice versa. In other words, these options of left versus right are mere variations on a theme. If we look at the variables involved as 1 and 2, then the left could be said to have a preponderance of 1 and B has a preponderance of 2, but 1 greater than 0 and 2 greater than 0. Socialism is a tolerance for the sins of the poor and capitalism tolerance for the sins of the rich. Public and private ownership reflect the kind of sin tolerated. Public ownership gives property to the masses, whereas private ownership gives it to the elites. Yet, regardless of if we speak about the left or the right, it is a few rich and powerful men who own and control everything. In communism, the mansions go to the party faithful. In capitalism, they go to the ones who control the market. It is therefore natural to assume the fear capitalists have of these populist and socialist movements are because of the threat they pose to private property. But this same fear can be seen in the left when movements on the right take root, for example the MAGA movement. The left fears their benefit packages being taken away from them, the right fears the reduction of private property rights. But despite the open animosity that exists between the right and left, there is a tacit burying of hatchets when it comes to fighting their common enemy. This has various facets, but none are what the left and right fear. In the war of good versus evil, this system and all who are part of it are solidly on the side of evil. There is a war going on between the left and right, but it is not the war that we see between the political and economic wings of liberalism. This is what some like to call a false flag operation. False flags are wars of diversion. They exist to cover what is really going on. The true left and right are not tied to conventional institutions. Yet it is still true to say that the right is more right, that is closer to being correct, than the left is. Whites are closer to the truth than other groups. The West is more just than the East. This is not a matter of subjective evaluation. The comparison is based on objective values. The objective truth found on the right is why we find performative leaders are always attached to left-leaning groups. There is a war going on, but this war is both logical and moral. It is not a war about relative degrees of power. Those in the wrong will always betray more emotion and be more performative because they do not have truth or logic on their side. We know BLM is on the left and that the right opposes them, even though the political and economic right is much further left than the Bible wants them to be. We know conservatives are often little more than more cautious liberals. There seems to be no true line of division. It is not uncommon to see people move towards the opposite side of the political spectrum. So there cannot be that much that divides them. Those on the left tend to be more sympathetic towards the masses, and those on the right are more concerned with the rights of individuals. This is often tied with age, as the older generations realize people are mostly authors of their own misfortunes. But there is something else that happens with age. Young people have nothing and are often overwhelmed at the prospect of earning all the things they think they need for the good life. So they look at all those who are more established have and thinks they ought to help them out. Young people are often still immature and retain the sense that the older have a responsibility to the younger. But the older person is likely more established and more focused on holding on to what they have than in fighting for resources from the state. This is what gives the older generation their tendency to align with the right. In terms of social movements such as BLM, the young and those of the older generation who squandered their youth want freebies. It is always about money when the rhetoric is stripped away. In this sense, the older generation and those who are less focused on getting help from others are more on the right. They are the ones who by their spiritual maturity have come closer to God. They are more spiritual. This has to be understood in the right way, for wealth does not make one spiritual. It is the reliance on one's capacity to provide for oneself that marks the spiritual person. But the fear and the animosity of the right to these social movements is because when there is a scarce resource and two bodies strive to gain it, there will be conflict. This is what we see in the social division that is growing. There is only so much property on the planet, and when two groups want it, there will be conflict. Because neither side has a right to any of what they fight over, there is no resolution but a physical one. This also exacerbates the violence. When the state helps Group A instead of Group B, Group A feels slighted and betrayed. The same goes when the situation is reversed. The hate and fear hark back to childhood, when the child, totally dependent on its parents, feels its needs are being ignored while some other child or situation is getting undue attention. In this sense, capitalists and those with property will fear those who think property is communal by nature. BLM is nothing more than communism tied up in a hate for whites as the capitalist. It is nothing more than a claim to unearned property. It does not make the claim made by capitalists stronger or weaker. It is just a claim made by those who will not work against property they did not create. This makes they someone to be feared by those who have property which can be stolen or expropriated.